Welcome to Through the Glass Columns, your weekly Wheel of Time read along podcast. The Wheel of Time turns and ages come and pass, leaving memories that become legend. Legend fades to myth, and even myth is long forgotten when the age that gave it birth comes again.
That is your host, Greg, who somehow still knows very little about the Wheel of Time, even though he usually pretends otherwise.
And that is Tylor, our resident expert, who makes sure you know how much he knows about the Wheel of Time.
It's a lot. Join us each week as we continue our journey through Robert Jordan's great fantasy epic, exploring the books, the television show, ill-advised discussions of visual media on a non-visual podcast, and so much more. Although actually not, it's just that.
Yes, all that and actually nothing else as we travel on, and I know what this means now, through the glass columns.
Yeah, he really doesn't know all that much.
No, you don't know that much.
All right, sports fans, we got a triple header for you today. It's the Through the Glass Columns. I got so into my bit, I forgot the name of our podcast.
Not cutting this out.
It's Through the Glass Columns, your weekly Wheel of Time read-along podcast, coming to you with 3 chapters tonight from The Fires of Heaven. That is Chapter 36, A New Name, Chapter 37, Performances in Samara, and Chapter 38, An Old Acquaintance. I, of course, am Greg, the one who commits so hard to bits he forgets what show he's on. And I am joined by Tylor, who commits to no bits and never forgets what show he's on. Tylor, how's it going?
It really helps that I only do one podcast as opposed to yours like 3 or 4 a week. So it's pretty easy for me to remember what we're doing. That being said, I did not expect that level of energy for this week. I'll be honest. It is about time where I want to go to bed, and there is a Star Wars show that is in between me and going to bed, so we got to finish this fast so we can get to the new Star Wars show. Not that anyone knows when we are recording this. So last week, I feel like we kind of had the moment where we said, yes, finally, this roller coaster is moving. I'm curious whether you felt that momentum continue this week, or was this kind of a letdown after what we had the previous week?
I grew up in the shadow of a very famous mountain in New Hampshire called Mount Monadnock, and there's this moment if you're taking the Dublin Side Trail, which is only a reference local people will know, where you are climbing up, and you reach a crest, and you're like, this is it, and then you look ahead, and you see like, oh no, it keeps going. This is just a little rise, and then the next rise is to come. And so I will say that's kind of how I felt this week, that we were kind of resting on the excitement of last week and all that we had seen and dealing with the fallout and the aftermath. And so then let's talk a lot more about dresses that show off women's bodies and circus tricks, and that's about it.
Yeah, let's be honest. When Robert Jordan needs to fill some time, it is somehow often about women's fashion, and we get a lot of that in these couple chapters. I don't really have too much else to dive into. It's a 3-chapter week, so we're kind of split up a little bit more in our commentary. Any last thoughts before we dive into Chapter 36?
I hope you can explain the third one to me, because I'm pretty lost. So let's start with the first one, though. So Chapter 36, A New Name.
Elayne watches while Birgitte mutters in her sleep, and she hears her say, Guidal, wait for me. Nynaeve returns, and then Tom and Julian enter. Tom produces a silver arrow, which apparently appeared at the same time that Birgitte was, and he reveals that he has more or less puzzled out what is going on with Birgitte, but Elayne refuses to confirm his suspicions because she wants to keep her promise to Birgitte. They then reveal that Nynaeve cried and apologized to them when she left for a walk rather than actually going and doing anything, and Julian compares her behavior to a woman he knew who accidentally killed her husband and eventually committed suicide. Tom says Elayne must be the one to help her because the men's plan, which was to get her laid, doesn't seem to work on women, and Elayne feels bad for concealing things from the men, but also tells them, and so eventually she tells them everything except for what is going on with Birgitte, and she thinks to herself the story doesn't fully make sense without those details, but the men are willing to accept it anyways. The men choose to stay, and when Tom says he is staying to teach her, she chooses to kiss him on the cheek, and Julian says that he is going to stay to avoid angering Rand, and then when she insists that isn't a good enough reason, she says it is because she is a woman in danger, and at this point, Elayne orders them to go to sleep, and Tom says that she sounded like her mother. Elayne then talks to Nynaeve, convincing her to wash her feet, at which point she breaks down and refuses to go to sleep, causing Elayne to snap at her, telling her that she is done with her self-pity, and eventually Nynaeve gives in and does fall asleep, as does Elayne. She dreams of bonding Rand and thinks that she must be a green now because she intends to have 2 warders, and she also dreams of a number of her rivals before eventually settling on the woman from Elayne, that's her name, eventually settling on her and hearing her speak what she eventually realizes is what Birgitte is saying, having finally woken up. She realizes that she is no longer in Teleron Riode and immediately starts to worry about Gaidal Kane, saying that she will not be there for him and he will search, not knowing what she is looking for, and she cries despite saying that she has never done so in all of her trips through the wheel. Birgitte then asks after Nynaeve and seems to dismiss Nynaeve's role in what happened, and Birgitte seems, honestly, for this story, remarkably well adjusted to everything. Then she talks about her bond and asks about it, and Elayne tells her that she is only an accepted rather than an Aes Sedai, and Birgitte tells the tale of that happening once in the past, and it not going especially well, and it turns out Elayne recognizes that tale, although dramatically changed through the years. Birgitte thanks her for saving her life and agrees to be her warder as well as her friend. Birgitte says part of being a warder is telling an Aes Sedai when they are pushing themselves too far, and so she insists that Elayne go to sleep. Elayne tries to put this off by altering clothes for Birgitte, but eventually she does fall asleep and once again dreams of bonding Rand, but this time dreams that she would be willing to do so without his permission. At this point, Nynaeve wakes up, desperate to help Birgitte, seemingly willing to get her food and help her dress, and as the men are setting up the wagons once Elayne leaves, Luca arrives and says that he is preparing the performers and they want to be set up in Samara by noon at the latest. He sees Birgitte and asks her to be a fool in the show, but she says she is an archer while he mocks her resemblance to the actual Birgitte. She challenges him to an archery contest, which he reluctantly agrees to. She shoots first, and after she adds distance to the range, she chooses 4 arrows and fires them all in rapid succession, scoring 2 bullseyes and then 2 arrows that split her previous 2 bullseyes. Luca then revises Nynaeve's act, saying that Birgitte will fire arrows instead of Tom throwing knives, and Luca agrees that he is going to put this on, and that Birgitte is going to wear the same red dress that Nynaeve was going to, at which point Birgitte says that she refuses to pretend that she is, well, Birgitte, and tells him to call her Marion, a name that she apparently had gone by before, and then she confirms that she wants a red dress, much to Nynaeve's dismay. There's a lot going on in this chapter, and it is all in like 2-line sentences in the middle of descriptions of red dresses. What did you think of A New Name, which is, I think, the closest to an action-packed chapter we get this week, but it's a lot of move the plot along action and not blow things up action.
Yeah, I would say, we had to deal with the fallout from last week, and we just had to kind of integrate Birgitte into the troupe of the performers and into the kind of stories that are going on, and largely that happens without incident. We talked last week about how Nynaeve has been humbled a lot, and while the characters kind of stop her from further kind of self-pity, it just felt like, she's still getting kind of all stomped on here, and everybody's above Nynaeve. And like I said last week, I'm starting to feel bad for her, even though she's not my favorite character amongst these.
Yeah, I'll be the first to say I am someone who at a couple times in my life have hit a relative rock bottom, and it immediately changed my behavior in a significant way. And I am really curious after reading this chapter whether this is Nynaeve's rock bottom. Right? At this point, I really only see there as being 2 ways for Nynaeve to progress forward. Either this is where she hits her bottom, and from here on out, she is going to be kind of improving and growing and making sure nothing like this ever happens again, or she is going to give in to despair, and something like this will definitely happen again because she doesn't learn anything and make herself do better. So I guess my question for you is, do you feel like this is actually the moment where Nynaeve turns it around, or is this our first red herring? It feels like she's broken down enough she could change, but maybe she won't. Which of those possibilities feels more likely here?
Wait, was one of your rock bottoms my failed baseball bit from the top of the show?
No, but that's a good idea. That should be something that changes my life.
I don't know. So I want this to be the rock bottom, and that she'll kind of start to rebound and build her way back up and find some kind of redemption. That also makes sense for about where we are in this book, right? That we have, a third to go ish. Nah, a little more than that, but less than a half. So I kind of want that to be it, but honestly, the piece that is kind of standing out to me is that like she still has Lan, or the dream of Lan, and it feels like real rock bottom would be her having lost that relationship in some way. I don't know. She's certainly estranged, not in the kind of torrid sense, but just like in the literal sense. They are apart. So it could be that that's enough, but it doesn't feel like true rock bottom for Nynaeve would still give her access to Lan. So I don't know.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point, especially given what Nynaeve is going through in the previous chapters, which is, I think it was maybe only 2 or 3 chapters ago, the end of a chapter for Nynaeve was like, hey, maybe I will flirt with that Valen Luca guy. And so seeing her kind of off-kilter in all of these other ways really makes me wonder, like, does that push her so off-center that Luca becomes a viable option? Or, as you say, does it kind of push her back into the only thing still grounding her, which would be that, like, furtive relationship with Lan. Other than this, I just need to point out Nynaeve apologized, and I don't think that's happened before in 4.5 books. So more than anything else, that's what's got me worried about this character.
Well, and I think it's also still playing up that this is the biggest mistake we've seen. We've talked before about some of these forces that seem like we're in a different kind of cycle, and that, the presence of the Forsaken at the Eye of the World way back in book 1, for example, and so on. But this feels like they really broke something, and the kind of talking about her lost beloved, Birgitte's, I'm going to butcher the name, so you'll say it correctly right now.
Gaidal,
is to me a suggestion that whatever happens now is really off script, right? That for those characters, there's a part to play, and that's going to be really different. And it was striking to me that it's her Brigitte's concern about like what's going to happen in the future, not at this moment.
Yeah, and I thought that was actually the moment where I kind of fell in love with Birgitte in this chapter, right? There's something really wonderful about a character who has everything taken away from her and yet still has a head on her, like perfectly well screwed on her shoulders, right? She is not concerned about herself because she's just fine. She is concerned about Gaidal Cain. And that was a moment that really kind of ripped my heart out, because the way she describes it is not he will fail in his adventures, it's he will constantly be looking for me and not know what he's looking for. And that is just so much worse. And so I thought that the moment in the last chapter that was really telling was when Elayne said, I hope Nynaeve doesn't realize how much Birgitte really lost. And the fact that Birgitte wakes up and immediately recognizes what she lost, I thought really sold that moment of like, this is a real bad place for that character to be in her relationship with, history.
Agreed. And, I think whenever history and the cycle of history in this universe comes up, it feels like that's the most important stuff. So that's part of where I'm getting this feeling that we've really broken something important this time.
So if that is what you're focused on, I want to talk about the 2 other instances of weird deep time stuff going on in this chapter. The first is when Elayne mentions that she is only an accepted. Birgitte says, oh, that happened once in the past, and then she lists off 2 names who Elayne has read stories about, romance books, but those romance stories did not include the fact that one of them was an accepted when they bonded the other, and in fact didn't even include the fact that the woman could channel. And so that really sets up kind of this really interesting idea that like the stories we are used to hearing are true, but they can also be really wrong at the same time, which then I think plays really fun at the end of the chapter where Birgitte says, oh, my name is Marion, immediately after doing an enormous amount of Robin Hood stuff. right? And so I think this is the chapter that's really trying to reinforce for us Birgitte really is all the people from the stories we've heard, but those stories might be so wrong that Maid Marian was the archer. And let's be honest, given the physique of Gaidal Kane, I'm willing to bet Lil Jon was her lover.
I'm just picturing foxes and brown bears because that's my only Robin Hood association. But that's really interesting, and I'm not going to pretend I thought of any of that, though I did catch, the arrows splitting the arrows, is obviously a call to classic Robin Hood. But that's further interesting to me in the same sense as, like, before we've talked about how maybe our historical events became their stories, and now it's like our stories became their stories. Although I was just watching a really bad movie where character was failing a college exam because they called King Arthur their favorite fictional character, and they're like, no, he lived, he was a real guy. So maybe that's the problem.
Yeah, well, that's the interesting thing about this world, right, is you're saying our stories become their legends, but the only way that happens is because at one point Birgitte actually lived the Robin Hood story and it became a story, right? And so that cyclical, is this the Robin Hood story we heard that will eventually get so off kilter that we think Robin Hood is Marian, or is she referring to the last time that happened thousands of years ago and that's the version of the story we've heard? This is the fun Wheel of Time thing, right? Is everything is both in the past and yet to come. That being said,
you got a weird way to define fun.
I don't really have too much else to point out in this chapter other than a couple of really small character moments that I liked. Elayne kissing Tom on the cheek when he says he wants to teach her. Lovely moment. Want that all of the time. Elayne being really open and honest, both with Birgitte and Tom and Julian, and immediately getting buy-in from that. Something I wish would happen way more often in this series. And then finally, Nynaeve basically being willing to do anything for Birgitte the second she wakes up, I thought was really telling of where that character is at. Those are all just itty-bitty, teeny-tiny moments, but did any of those stand out, or was there anything else in the chapter that you were like, that's the thing that really kind of latched onto?
I mean, I don't have much here. I did like that Tom Elayne moment that you just shouted out, and it really felt to me interesting how so much of it was like, let's bring the boys in on the secrets and the extra plot. And while I think there was both reason to keep them separate and reason now to bring them inside, it kind of felt like Robert Jordan just doing some cleanup. Like, let's just simplify all this. Let's just get everybody on the same page so that, usually when that happens, it's because an author wants to get everything in line to start ramping up a plot. So I kind of had that feeling to it.
Yeah, I like that. And I think the one thing that Robert Jordan is doing to kind of upend that trope is he's not getting everyone caught up on everything. He's also using this as an opportunity to tell us about what Elayne values. And apparently that is promises to Birgitte over truth to Tom and Julian, which I think is very interesting. Unless you have last thoughts, and you are not looking like you do, I think Chapter 37, Performances in Samara, might not be the best name for this chapter. Nynaeve despairs at her dyed red hair, and also at the size of the crowds in Samara. She is covering up her red dress with her shawl, and Birgitte is wearing a matching red dress, and Nynaeve is very upset at how low-cut it is. Birgitte tells Nynaeve to be proud of being a woman, and that's why she should wear the dress proudly, and Nynaeve reluctantly agrees and drops the shawl, which surprises Birgitte. Birgitte then suggests lowering the neckline of the dress by another inch, or even painting her nude, or other ridiculous ideas, saying that Nynaeve needs to stop agreeing to everything that Birgitte says, and then Birgitte berates her for taking responsibility for Birgitte's choices, and as she says, trying to make Birgitte less. She deflects Nynaeve's objections to this, including those about her own weaknesses, and Birgitte refuses to let Nynaeve call herself a coward, saying that she is one of the bravest people she knows. Nynaeve says Birgitte can miss when they perform, but Birgitte says she will not. She shoots where she wants to, and she will not be aiming at Nynaeve. Birgitte then says she can only be friends with Nynaeve when Nynaeve is herself, and Nynaeve says Birgitte can do whatever she wishes, causing Birgitte to say she will make Nynaeve see the right of this. She says that she won't leave Elayne because she plans to honor her commitment to the bond, and she tells Nynaeve that she needs to curtsy on the way out, which causes Nynaeve to be very upset. After she leaves, Nynaeve thinks that embarrassment is far worse than the death that she wanted from Birgitte, and she worries that she won't be able to go on like this for a long time. The guards leer at her and her red dress until she covers up, and then she enters the menagerie proper. The circus is lively, especially around the Sreddit, and Tom juggles fire, and he is wearing his own coat, which very much outrages Nynaeve, and Luca tries to cozy up to Nynaeve until she elbows him. At this point, Julin, seemingly drunk, climbs up on the high rope despite objections from Luca, and then he begins crawling reluctantly across the high rope as Luca yells for him to get down. The crowd loves it, and he slips, hanging below the rope, and pulls himself hand over hand to the other platform, but then proceeds to immediately walk back across easily and makes his way down, revealing that Luca has been in on the act the entire time. Then Elayne emerges and also makes her way up to the top of the platform, although she is wearing a coat and slacks, which scandalizes Nynaeve. Elayne walks the rope. She is not channeling because Moghedien is looking for them, and Nynaeve is extremely nervous about how this is going to go, to the point that she tightly holds Valen Luca's arm, causing him to get the wrong ideas. Elayne walks the rope and then does a cartwheel, and then eventually does some other acrobatics, and it is noted that Tom is watching just as carefully as Nynaeve is. At this point, Nynaeve blames Tom for teaching Elayne, and then Elayne finally succeeds in her run through the tightrope and is swarmed on her way down. And at this point, Nynaeve hears a familiar face and spots a one-eyed man with a top knot, and she follows him. So I'm pretty sure that last sentence is the one that confuses Greg. What did you have to think about before that?
I mean, you referenced last chapter what made you fall in love with Birgitte. I really liked Birgitte here, and this to me is what a hero does. They, male or female, just owns their actions and their choices, and I loved the idea of don't diminish me by making my choices yours. And I don't know whether this will really help Nynaeve, but it did feel like the right thing to say to Nynaeve, and it's kind of pointing out her own Nynaeve's own vanity and arrogance that she would assume it's all on her. And so I just really liked it as a pep talk, and I was looking for some kind of connection between those characters, and this was just more fulfilling than I thought it would be.
Yeah, I think the way that I wanted to phrase this is just like everyone needs a friend like Birgitte, right? Like 90% of friends, when you are in a rough place, they will tell you how great you are and what you can do better and like how you are just a wonderful, bright light. And then 10% of your friends will be like, nah, dude, you screwed up. You need to do better next time. And we all need at least one friend who is willing to do that. And Birgitte is willing to be that friend for Nynaeve, and I really appreciate it here. I think that the moment that really won me over in this whole conversation was the moment where Birgitte basically says, you're the kind of person who I would give up on if you weren't friends with Elayne, but I refuse to give up on Elayne. And I don't know if that's what I think that might be the moment where Birgitte doesn't say what Nynaeve needs to hear, but she just says what is true, right? Mm-hmm. At some point, like, Nynaeve, you can do whatever you want, but Birgitte is here for Elayne, not you.
And I think that is similarly then just really intriguing. Is it really that much of a friendship that has sparked in Teleron Riode? I mean, it feels more intense than the parts of that relationship we've seen. Yeah. So it makes me feel more like there's, I think I'm about to quote a Pirates of the Caribbean movie. There's a hint of destiny about Elayne that Birgitte sees something in and needs to protect and needs to herald. I mean, obviously there's the warding and the connection and all that, but or the what's the word I'm looking for? Bonding.
The bond, yeah.
But it doesn't feel like that, and maybe that's a misreading to me. But it doesn't feel like because you're with Elayne, who I'm now bonded to, it actually feels like genuine affection or caring.
I actually hadn't made this connection until just now, but I think who it does feel like is Siwan Sancha, right? The moments where she is very clearly like, I will die if I wallow, and so instead I am going to choose something to dedicate my life to. It feels a little bit like that from Birgitte, right? She is so untethered from everything that came before, it almost feels like she is buying into this bond just because it gives her something to buy into.
Well, and that's interesting because that would put them on parallel tracks as like incredibly powerful entities that are suddenly without all their power, not just free and unbonded in some ways, although rebonded in this other way, free and untethered, but certainly lacking the power they once had. But again, Birgitte demonstrated last chapter she's still formidable. It's not like she came through without anything.
So I actually then want to really quickly jump to the end of the circus scene before we talk about the rest of the circus scene, because there was one moment in here that made me go, oh no, Nynaeve didn't learn the lesson at all. Because at the end of this section, Nynaeve is watching Elayne do her cartwheels, and she is so nervous about her, and she doesn't know what's going on. And then she looks over at Tom, and Tom is nervous and anxious, and Nynaeve's response is, damn, Tom, he taught her how to do cartwheels. And if you can't let Elayne take responsibility for her cartwheels, you certainly can't let yourself take responsibility for what happened to Birgitte. I think she missed the boat on this lesson.
I hadn't put that together, but, again, that fits into this, well, she can't really have hit rock bottom if she's not really learning lessons to pick herself back up. So I think that's a notch in the we've got further down to go.
So if that's what we've got to say about Nynaeve, boy, does Julian have a fun moment in this chapter, I guess. How much did drunken antics or pretend drunken antics work for you in the moment?
I'm having trouble caring about him in a lot of ways, but it was amusing, and these kind of dynamics within the circus troupe, I guess they're working to the degree that, like, if you're going to send some characters off in a menagerie, this is the kind of people you meet in a menagerie. So I'll give it a solid B.
Fair enough. On the other hand, I give a solid F to Nynaeve being scandalized that Elayne would dare wear pants. Maybe that's modern thought seeping in here, but I do not get much out of Nynaeve being nervous for Elayne and her revealing but not revealing outfit.
What came to mind is Jamila Jamil, who played Tahani on The Good Place. There's an episode where Tahani wears cargo pants, and Jamila Jamil revealed that was literally the first time she'd worn pants. She's a grown-ass woman, and she'd never worn trousers because she's British before. So I that still boggles my mind. Like, oh, the weird Americans made me wear cargo pants.
Yeah, I don't like any part of that. I hate that happened in like 2018. That's terrible. I did, however, enjoy the moment where Elayne is clearly... I guess I just love Elayne in this chapter, right? There's something really fun about a character who's like, oh, I can't do the thing that's been keeping me alive. No big deal. I'll do it anyways, right? Like, just being willing to go for it and learn everything in a couple of days really makes me appreciate that character in a way that it's not really easy to appreciate her for, skywalking when she's channeling air, but it really is for doing it.
Well, and it reminds me there is kind of a trope of the... I was going to say rich girl, but it's often princess specifically being really skilled because, like, oh, I've had to train in combat or I've had to do gymnastics. Yeah. I was trying to think of a good example. Princess Peach in the new Mario movie is kind of like that.
Yeah.
My kids watch that endlessly. Or I was thinking of Kate Winslet in Titanic where she goes drinking with the lower deck folks and she ends up going up on point, which isn't that impressive, but in the scene, it's constructed like she's blowing them away. But it kind of feels like Elayne is demonstrating that Elayne, yes, she grew up in a privileged life, but she does not lack for skills and bravery, as you noted.
Yeah, and I think the thing that really has always wowed me about Elayne as a character is how much the skills that she's picked up are not just the, like, be a princess skills. They are also the things that people around her were doing, right? A couple of weeks ago, we learned that Elayne is an excellent cook. That is not a traditional princess skill, but it's one that someone could very reasonably learn from the palace, cooks. And that's the kind of thing that I really like about Elayne is the version of her taking her princess and being talented with it is not like negotiation or giving speeches. It's the little things that you do in between actually being a princess, and that's kind of fun.
Definitely. And, I will just say as broadly that she's growing more on me as time goes on. I think that's partially just getting more screen time or page time. But, especially as Nynaeve's power and import has waned a bit, it seems like Elayne is filling that void and doing so aptly.
Yeah, I'm much more excited to read about Elayne than Nynaeve most of the time, I'll be totally honest. The only other moment that I have a real note on in my notes is there was just something fun about watching the dynamics of the circus play out, right? Like, when Nynaeve is walking through the crowds and noting that, like, the Sreddit have a huge crowd and the dogs barely have anyone, and she's very happy that the bear is not doing well, like, I've been to enough like little events like this that it rings true, and I always go to those events and I'm like, what does it have to be like to be the guy selling ice cream at the circus when it's negative 20 degrees outside, right? Like, that's how I feel for a couple of these characters, and it rings true enough that I enjoy it, even if there's not really any meat on those bones.
Well, I mean, there's a cliche at Comic-Cons about this, how the guy who played Goon number 7 in Batman will be at a table next to, like, the guy who drew the, issues 7 through 14 of the original Batman, and only the Goon will have people in line. And it's like, you see it all the time, and you feel bad for people who aren't getting that attention, but at the same time, you're like, well, I mean, you're the economist. It's literally like supply and demand.
Yeah, that's the thing, right? No one showing up to watch the dancing dogs makes perfect sense. It is not a problem with the system, but it is an accurate representation of the system. I also just kind of liked the idea that the people in town are like, well, I can see a bear in the forest, which is very much not how I want to see a bear, but sure, good for them. Any thoughts on chapter 37 before we dive into the last of our adventures?
No, I'll just point out at the end of my notes, I just have Elayne in all capital letters. I don't know why. I don't know if I was impressed by the cartwheel or the feats. I mean, that seems most likely, but
it
just cracks me up that it's after the eye patch is already mentioned. So I have no idea why at the very end I was just like, Elayne. But anyway, how about chapter 38?
An Old Acquaintance. Nynaeve pushes through the crowd, following the man that she saw at the end of the last chapter. She observes people entering the circus and using a clear jug for coins, as well as 2 levels of security around all of the money. She calls out to the man, who she calls Uno, and after a little bit of prompting, he remembers her, saying that he saw her both at Falm and also previously in the far north in the city that Faldara, that is the name of that city. He drags her along and then insists that she follow once she no longer is allowing herself to be dragged. And when eventually prodded, he says that they are going somewhere where they can't be overheard. And he says that all of the crowds in the area think that Rand is the creator himself, and so it can be very dangerous to mention his name, as it could cause a riot. Uno says that they are going into town, and then he remembers that she was traveling with Moraine, who he calls the Blue Woman. He says that he can get her enough coin to get her to Tyr, where Rand is, or potentially to get her to Tar Valon, although he has heard about all of the turmoil in Tar Valon, and that he is dismayed when he thinks that either Moraine is Varen is with him, but eventually he learns that they are not, and he seems relieved by this, but then he is shocked when he learns that he saw Elayne perform, and he seems kind of almost on an edge about whether it is worse to have a princess or an Aes Sedai among them. At this point, Nynaeve asks why he is here. He explains that Moraine sent the group to see a contact of hers, but she was dead when they arrived. At this point, Mazima started, quote, talking to people, and now all of the other Faldarans stay close to him in order to make sure that they can get all of the supplies they need, as Mazima is able to take all of their needs into account. Mazima apparently is the prophet of the dragon, and Nynaeve is told that he could get Nynaeve a boat, and she thinks about all of the riots that have followed Mazima, and Uno says not to mention the Aes Sedai around him. He mentions that Mazima is almost as negative towards those who can channel as the White Cloaks are. At this point, Nynaeve asks after the White Cloaks in the area, and we learn that they destroyed a show over rumors of a woman being able to channel, and then at this point, Nynaeve continues onward, even as Uno realizes the city is too dangerous to lead her through. I'd ask you what you got out of this chapter, but first I feel like I just need to tell you who Uno is.
Well, I think I was expecting more, because the title chapter, An Old Acquaintance, although that is literally true. It is not an old friend. It's an old acquaintance. I think just usually when that is used, it means it's kind of used euphemistically to be somebody who holds greater meaning. Yeah. So it does just feel like this is a dude who was traveling with them before and kind of remembers them. And you know, because these characters are on the run and we just knew that Moghedien was sending people out to search the menageries, I think it makes me immediately suspicious. Yeah. But it just feels like so bland and vanilla that, like, it's neither, like, there aren't enough clues to suggest that he's negative, nor are there kind of very obvious reasons why he's a good guy. It's just like, it doesn't feel significant, and I don't think that's the way.
I'm sorry, maybe we have different opinions about how to trust people, but anyone who has difficulty only swearing once every other sentence, that's a good dude. You trust that guy every single time. This podcast makes me a liar. I can't lie on it. It's a problem. I'll be honest, Uno is one of my favorite itty-bitty random side characters exclusively because of his habit of being unable to go a sentence without saying bloody somewhere in the sentence. I find him to be fun, and this is kind of our first opportunity to get in on that fun, which is great. But I think you're exactly right. If you were looking for, like, what is the big moment in this chapter where the revelation of who he is changes everything, no, that doesn't happen here. Just a quick reminder of Uno and the Shinarans. We initially met them very briefly in the Eye of the World when Lan arrived at Fal Dara and was being introduced to a number of people, but we mostly started to get to know them in the second book when Rand and Perrin and Matt were sent on the hunt for the Horn of Valir. They were accompanied by a number of people. Most notable at the time was the Lord Agelmar, but we also met a number of other colorful characters, including Uno, the man with one eye who can't stop swearing, and Mazima, the very quiet man who seemed really dedicated to every cause and really willing to die for the cause. We then left them more or less at the beginning of the third book. Moraine and Lan and Perrin went off in search of Rand, and the rest of them vanished, right? The Shinarans have not been in it since then, but we have heard a number of references to the prophet or the prophet of the dragon, and we had also heard ideas that prophet was one of the Shinarans who had traveled with Rand. Now we can put a really specific name to that. Mazima, the quiet, dedicated one, is now the prophet. He apparently has riots following him all over the continent, and at the same time, Uno and several others of the Shinarans, we learn in this chapter, they are following along with Mazima so that they can get kind of the benefits of being with the prophet, but they do not believe what he is prophesying at all. And so I think that is really telling of these characters. You're right to say they are kind of vanilla and generic, other than Mazima, who is starting to feel really like dark gray in the way that he is being framed. Does that clarify things? And do you have any further questions about these characters or the kind of their placement in the story?
No, I think what's shocking to me about that is I basically had all of that. The Prophet of the Dragon stuff would be the stuff I forgot the most of, though I did recognize that name when it was kind of dropped. I'm like, oh, that's a thing we've heard before, but certainly not the specifics of it. So sounds interesting to me. It sounds like, again, we get another group that's kind of crisscrossing across this south section of the map. So I'm curious to see how long they stay entwined, or if it's just kind of, these guys are out there doing their thing too.
Speaking of just out there doing their thing, my first note in this chapter actually has nothing to do with the major plot points of this chapter. I just thought it was really nice to see a real acknowledgement of how expensive it is to run a business in medieval times. Right? The fact that you need a giant glass jug with guards around it, and then guards to watch the guards, and then guards to watch the guards watching the guards, that is exactly correct in a world where your best defense from someone stealing your stuff is a club. And I think I need to just give Robert Jordan credit. Like, there are a lot of fantasy series that treat medieval economies as being modern economies, but without cars. And that is very much not the case. And I think Robert Jordan is doing a good job of acknowledging the challenges of running a business that travels in a world where the fastest form of travel is elephant.
That just is a beautifully Tylor point that I will let stand as a tribute to you and your sensibilities.
The next thing I want to talk about is Uno himself. Because we got the detail about the history of Uno, but I need to at least briefly acknowledge, and please just skip 30 seconds if you haven't watched the television show, Uno has a
I'm
very...
listening live. Sorry, I'll go on.
Uno has an exceptionally different plot in season 2 of the television show than he did in the second book. If you will recall, there is a Shinaran who has one eye in the television show, and he gets murdered in the second episode of season 2 and comes back when the Horn of Valir blows. That is very clearly Uno, but this is a character who is being set up for a lot more than what he got in the television show. So I just, one, want to note that comparison, and two, note if you watched the show and remembered the one-eyed guy and are like, oh, he's going to be gone soon because he's gone in the TV show, do not rely on that. There's a lot of almost swearing yet to come.
Wait, he came back as a hero of the Horn?
Yeah, so when Matt blows the horn in the last episode, the one-eyed Shinaran is back and fighting alongside them. Yeah. That's all he had to say. I can add more to that.
Yeah, I just said, that's all I got. Interesting. I didn't recall that. But it's been a little while since we watched that now. We're closing in on a year, I think, since we watched that.
A year plus, possibly. So then my next follow-up is what the Prophet of the Dragon is teaching. And this was the most interesting moment in the chapter to me. Nynaeve attempts to avoid any mention of anything that could be dangerous by referring to the Dragon Reborn as Rand instead of the Dragon Reborn. And the response that Uno gives her is, do not use that name. Everyone knows his name, and everyone thinks he is a god. Even saying his name could get you in trouble in this city. And that is, A, not the way that we have seen the Dragon Reborn perceived anywhere else, and B, I don't think that is how Rand would want the Dragon Reborn to be perceived. I'm really now starting to get worried about what is this prophet doing and how much is he kind of poisoning the well for people that Rand would eventually like to win over to his side.
Well, and that just makes me think of all the Forsaken we've gotten hints at who are going around manipulating things. It's like, oh, well, this feels like another Chaos agent, and we have a list of those who may or may not, be acting as the Prophet of the Dragon or controlling somebody who's acting as Prophet of the Dragon.
Yeah.
And I'm sure you can't say anything about that, but what's your next point?
Not even a little bit. My next point is that Uno seems really hesitant about a couple of characters that he seemed really positive towards in previous books, right? So Uno and Varen actually have a couple of pretty good scenes in book 2 where they kind of joke around with each other. Uno never seemed to have any issues with Moraine, and yet in this chapter, what he refers to as the blue woman and the brown woman strike fear in his heart at the idea that they are near Samara. And I think this is both an extension of the previous point. We need to be worried about kind of like how is the Prophet of the Dragon shaping perceptions of Aes Sedai and others, but there's also just a really interesting moment of like, it's been 3 books since we've checked in with the Shinarans, and even the ones who don't buy into Mazima's crap seem to have problems with Aes Sedai that they didn't, 1,000 pages ago.
Well, and again, so much of that Northern Kingdom feels like it's coming back around, but we're so far away from there. So it's like I can't read that as all Shinarans or, necessarily their leaders or their kings or, Lan being the prophesied ruler of a slightly different kingdom, but full of people who are there. It's like, and Perrin and his bride headed that way-ish, not purely north. So it feels like, we have a friend reading Game of Thrones and is at those books that were split north-south. And it almost feels like we've got a north book coming next. That this feels like we have to get back to these plot lines.
Yeah, I think that's the thing. Of all of the chapters, this is the one this week that feels like it is setting up the next book instead of setting up things that will happen later this book. And I think that's why I'm maybe less high on this chapter compared to the other two. It's not that it's doing anything different. It just feels less urgent when we're talking about the other side of the continent. And I guess the other version of this that we have, it's maybe the same point, so I don't know how much you'll have to add. I just had a big, deep breath, it'll be okay moment when the Shienarans are like, yeah, Moraine had a plan for us, and then all the people who were supposed to make that plan happen had been killed, right? That makes me really think, okay, if we are setting up things for later books, we're setting up some pretty deep whodunit type mysteries, potentially, on top of just the prophetess screwing stuff up.
And I was just going to add a note from a second ago. It's hard to remember. We also got the deep tease about the snow mountains in the recent Rand chapter. So it's like that felt like it was 3 books from now. So Robert Jordan seems to be pausing in the middle of this book to kind of do a lot of work to set up what's to come. And, that's necessary in a series like this. I continue to feel like this book more than the last book is really like him saying, okay, I thought I only had a trilogy. I got the 4th. Now as I move into the 5th, I really got to start building out the long series and the full series.
It is worth noting, next week, we will be at almost exactly 1/3 of the way through the Wheel of Time. And so if we're thinking about where this is at in kind of the development of the series and kind of building long-term plots, we're right about at the end of the Fellowship of the Ring. We've still got some world building left to do before we get to the big battles and such.
So you're promising horse people. Yay, horse people.
Yay, horse people. I don't think there are really that many horse people in this book. I guess what we've got then is Uno is just a really fun character. I just need to acknowledge that the scene where he is literally counting his words to make sure that he doesn't swear too often, I cannot stop smiling when I read it, no matter how many times I reread that section of the book. He is just fun to read, even if maybe Nynaeve is the worst character to be in while experiencing Uno because she criticizes instead of enjoying all of his quirks.
He seems like he'd be fun to have around Tom, right?
Yeah.
He could bring out the fun side of Tom. So, yeah, I'm excited to see this character develop a little more. And I think I felt so much pressure to remember who this was, but what you're telling me more with the spirit of your comments than your words is just look forward to having him around. And, okay, yeah. I can do that.
Yeah, he's a fun dude. He swears a lot. I guess then the last thing I've got in this chapter is we get a good 2-3 pages of everything is terrible in Samara, and then without thinking of it, Nynaeve's response is, well, I guess I'm going to Samara. And this is mostly, I think, set up for next week as opposed to next book, but we get hints at the Prophet causing riots, we get hints at the White Cloaks being willing to sick a mob on a menagerie if there's a hint of channeling going on. And we also get this kind of story that even Uno worries that just walking around in the city is dangerous, setting aside those 2 very big kind of players that are causing issues. What are you looking forward to in the rest of this plot line, right? We know that next week one of the chapters includes the word Samara, so we expect to stick around here for at least a little longer, but at best we've probably got 6-7 chapters left with these characters. What are you expecting that to look like?
I still struggle because I expected them to get to Solidara, and I don't know that it's literally true, but it feels like Samara is moving in the opposite direction from that reunion, and it's more that they're establishing their own continuing plots instead of kind of needing to fold in. So I am interested to see where that goes. So we do have 2 chapters next week. The first being chapter 39, Encounters in Samara, and then chapter 40, The Wheel Weaves, which often portends big action or some significant changes. I'm willing to put down money that the first one is with these characters, but I'm not willing to put down money that the second one is with them.
I agree with your point on both of those things, and I want to complicate. You think that this first chapter is going to definitely follow these characters, because peep that chapter icon on Encounters in Samara. It is not what I would be expecting in an Elayne and Nynaeve chapter. I'm really excited to see where we go from here. After today, we have 10 weeks left, and that means the countdown is on for the Fires of Heaven to reach its conclusion. I'll let you do the outro today, but I'm really excited with where we're at. This was a slightly slower week, but I still kind of feel that momentum from last week pulling me forward. How are you feeling about the book overall? And then, say the name of the podcast for the people.
Yeah, I think if I had been reading in natural circumstances, I probably would have come out of that high of the Birgitte chapters and just kind of cruised right through these and not even noticed the kind of dip in momentum. It is kind of the blessing and curse of our format that we sometimes see those changes or those shifts more dramatically because it's 2 weeks instead of, maybe an hour if you were reading this on your own. But I'm excited. I'm cruising along. I noticed that next week gets us a mere 300 pages from the end, so we really are just kind of cruising towards it. And we will look forward to everyone joining us back once again next week through the glass columns.
So ends another episode of Through the Glass Columns. We thank you for joining us and continuing with us on our quest to cover all of the Wheel of Time in our own sweet time.
This podcast features original content developed by Tylor Orm and Greg Cass and is not in any way affiliated with, associated with, or condoned by the Robert Jordan Estate, Tor Fantasy, Amazon, or our wives. All content is intended for entertainment and educational purposes only.
If you're enjoying this podcast, please seek out the books from your local bookshop or library and join us as we continue our journey. If you'd like to contact us to share your thoughts or give feedback, find us on Instagram or Threads by searching Through the Glass Columns.
Thank you once again for being a part of this community. If you're enjoying the show, please subscribe, leave us a review wherever you are listening, and recommend this show on your social media to help us grow our community. We look forward to welcoming you back next time on Through the Glass Columns.